Today's midterm elections will determine who will take control over the House and Senate. And while some polls predict a potential nightmare scenario for liberals in losing both chambers, Democrats remain optimistic, hoping that abortion rights and dropping gas prices are enough to entice voters in swing states. That's according to The Hill's Hanna Trudo.
Senior political correspondent for The Hill, Hanna Trudo, joins us now to discuss. Welcome, Hanna.
Hi, guys. Happy Election Day.
Yes, happy Election Day to you. So is the enthusiasm, so right now I'm seeing sort of fake enthusiasm being projected, or what I take to be fake enthusiasm. Behind the scenes, is it a kind of demoralized environment among progressives, the way you might expect, given what we all think kind of is going to happen?
Yeah, absolutely. I think behind the scenes and overall out in front. I mean, for that piece, it took me quite a while to find a couple of Democrats who were not totally unhopeful, I guess, for the outcome of today's elections. I mean, look, the Democrats have been basically talking up potential losses, not just at the House level, which we've heard for months and months, but more recently of the Senate too. And so there are, there's a doom and gloom that sort of prevails today and this week, in the past couple of weeks, towards how the party in power will fare in today's elections. But I mean, in terms of the few that are kind of optimistic, they have a few reasons to point to. And I think one of the more fair arguments, or at least one of the bigger unknowns, is the early voting numbers, which, do tend to favor Democrats. Obviously, we've seen historic numbers of votes already been cast in some of these critical elections. I'm thinking Pennsylvania and Georgia in particular, where it's really, really nail biter in both of those races. But it's a big unknown. And so the Democrats who are hopeful are basically hanging those hopes on the record number of turnout in some of these critical places to be enough to outweigh the surge that's expected to come in person from the Republicans.
Hanna, what do we know about what polling tells us with respect to turnout in the abortion issue in particular? We saw in Kansas, there were some earlier moments in the year during the primaries, during these ballot initiatives, et cetera, that it seemed like the abortion issue specifically drove turnout for Democrats, even if it wasn't necessarily the issue that was ranked as a high priority in terms of overall issues like the economy, gas prices, inflation, things like that. Is the kind of unprecedented turnout that we're seeing in places like Georgia attributed to abortion being on the ballot? And if so, why is it being treated like a zero-sum game? Why haven't Democrats been able to balance the benefits of using abortion as a draw to the polls and the broader issues which would incline independent voters to go ahead and vote for Democrats once they show up on Election Day?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, basically what's happened was Democrats, right after the Roe decision came out over the summer, we're pretty much hopeful that was going to be what saved them in the midterm. So they put all of their organizational muscle and their messaging towards abortion being that big fight at the ballot box. And so they planned on that message. They coalesced pretty quickly among both the progressive left and more moderate mainstream Democrats, and really worked on in a lot of these critical states and districts to make that the message. And what we've seen over the past couple of months is like you kind of alluded to, that hasn't necessarily been, they haven't been able to balance that or juggle that between the overwhelming polling concerns of voters, number one being the economy, and just haven't been able to make the case effectively that, like many have tried in the last couple of weeks and months here, that abortion is, of course, tied to economic concerns of voters, but there's been a real disconnect. And so what we've seen in the last couple of days and weeks in particular is basically like a backing off of that issue. And so in terms of the early voting turnout, I don't know that there's been necessarily concrete data we can look to yet in places like Georgia with regard to abortion specifically, but it's certainly possible that was one of the motivating factors, again, without having the data, in front of me or even available yet. But it's because if that does end up being the case, it would likely be because those ballots had already been cast well before Election Day. And so that factored into some of these more, like I said earlier, some of these more hopeful, optimistic Democrats, that factored into their thinking when they planned out their early vote strategy. They were thinking of some of these more bombshell kind of social issues being a motivating factor early on. And we'll see. It's kind of a risky strategy, but certainly the numbers are there in terms of record-breaking turnout in Georgia. A little over 2 million voters have already sent in ballots or voted at the polls, and I think in Pennsylvania about 1 million or so, and that's very significant for those two states.
Is the blame game already getting underway on the Democratic side? I remember a lot of kind of narrative discussion after the last election cycle, a lot of bashing, kind of more centrist establishment Democrats, blaming further left Democratic Socialist Democrats for scaring voters, and then oftentimes then progressives will say, well, if you actually delivered on the things we wanted, that would make voters happy. Is that kind of infighting getting underway?
Yeah, a little bit, although this cycle will be different, I think, because it's really the progressives who, like in the past cycles, obviously, the 2016 election, presidential level, the 2018 midterms, 2020 presidential election, the progressives were the ones largely making that economic populist pitch to voters. And that's what the more centrists and moderates are now saying, wow, we should have really focused on that a little bit earlier on. So I think, my focus in the next couple of days following the results, as soon as we get them, is going to be whether progressives really seize on that opportunity to say, look, we've been sounding the alarm, notably Fetterman, and some other progressives down ballot, Mandela Barnes, another one who's, projected to lose. But it's just a matter of how progressives are going to be able to or not make the case that they were actually the ones pushing the economic message for the party at the party level, kind of to the chagrin of their more moderate counterparts. And that will obviously be interesting to see how that fight goes in the coming weeks and months.
That's such an important point. Progressives have been screaming, not just in those previous election cycles, but in this one. Bernie Sanders was one of the first to raise his head up and say, maybe we should be talking about the economy. And there was a lot of blowback that he received as a consequence of doing so. So I'm very curious to see how the blame game pans out, if the Democratic fates are not what they're hoping to be this evening and over the week as the results come out. Thank you so much for joining us, Hanna.
Thanks for having me, guys.
We'll have more Rising after this.